6 murders, 6 weeks. California's prisons are bleeding. Each life taken not in the shadows, but inside the walls of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The place that was supposed to control violence became the stage for it. And here's the haunting truth: this wasn't an accident. This was policy. This was design. Because under political pressure, California decided to copy and paste a model from across the ocean, the Norway model. A system built for a country with different demographics, different culture, different gangs, different everything. On paper, it sounds noble. Treat inmates with humanity, integrate the violent with the vulnerable, build harmony inside the walls. But here's the question: what happens when you put wolves in the same cage as sheep and call it reform? That's exactly what California did, and the blood spilled almost immediately. See, Norway's prisons work because Norway doesn't have the same war running through its veins. Norway doesn't have LA gangs that control entire neighborhoods. They don't have the Aryan Brotherhood carving lines into history. They don't have the Black Guerrilla family, the Mexican Mafia, the Norteños, the Sureños, the Crips, the Bloods. In California, gang culture is not just a presence. It's the architecture of the prison system. Every yard, every cell block, every table in the chow hall is divided along racial and organizational lines. For decades, the California system ran on one brutal but simple code: general population and protective custody. General population, the GP, was where the so-called active inmates lived. You walked the yard, you followed the rules, you played by prison politics. You earned respect by surviving in the general population. And then there was PC, protective custody. Later renamed SNY sensitive needs yards, this was where the unwanted went. Sex offenders, informants, cross-dressers, and later dropouts. Men who had once lived in the GP but couldn't anymore. To the GP, these men were nothing. Trash, dead weight. Not worthy of respect, but something unexpected happened. These sensitive yards began to fill with not just outcasts, but with numbers. Dropouts from gangs, defectors, men who ran up debts. Men who broke under pressure, men who didn't want the politics anymore, and as their numbers grew, a new phenomenon was born. SNY gangs, dropout gangs, men who had once sworn allegiance to prison organizations, now reforming into new groups with new names, new colors, new rules. By the early 2000s, names like the 25ers, the Independent Riders, the Northern Riders, the Zapatistas started spreading through the system, each claiming to be different, each claiming to be free of the tyrannies of the GP. But in truth, many of them became exactly what they had run away from: violent, predatory, chaotic. And here's what most people don't realize: the chaos in the SNY yards often became worse than the GP. Because in the GP, for all its brutality, there was structure, there was hierarchy, there were rules. In the SNY yards, it was a free-for-all, every man for himself. Respect, once currency, became counterfeit. And with no true leaders, no codes, violence had no leash. But let's rewind. To understand why this spiral began, you have to go back to the 1970s. California once ran on indeterminate sentencing. Judges had flexibility. But in 1977, under Governor Jerry Brown, the state shifted. Determinate sentencing. The sentence had to fit the crime. Sounds fair, right? Except it lit the fuse. The crack epidemic of the 1980s turned California into a war zone. Gangs surged, violence skyrocketed, and lawmakers panicked. 3 strikes laws, sentences doubled, 80% time requirements, gang enhancements, gun enhancements, RICO charges. The prison population exploded. By the 1990s, California's prisons were bursting, and with them, the gangs inside only grew stronger. The state tried to fight back. The SHU program's segregated housing units were designed to isolate gang leaders, to cut off the head of the snake, but what they created instead was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, new leaders, unqualified, unstable, often addicted, rose to power. Crash dummies, tyrants with drugs and money, but no discipline. The motto once whispered in the yards, "Make a homie, don't break a homie," was replaced by something darker. Make a homie, just to break a homie. And when the oppression grew unbearable, many inmates did the unthinkable. They dropped out. They joined PC. They entered SNY. At first, the SNY yards were small, pockets of protective custody at places like Mule Creek and the California Men's Colony. But the numbers swelled, and when the dropouts grew too many to ignore, they began to organize. The 25ers, formed by defectors from the Mexican Mafia and Sureños. They branded themselves as a brotherhood of dropouts, a new family, the Independent Riders, defectors from white gangs, Nazi lowriders, skinheads, building their own empire, the Northern Riders, led by a charismatic figure named Badass Snoop, a man who knew how to recruit, how to preach, how to pull young inmates into his orbit. The Zapatistas, a new group built on ideology. They required lifers, often lifers who had committed murder, to join. They preached revolution, modeled themselves after Emiliano Zapata, declaring war against both the administration and rival gangs. And yet, behind the slogans, behind the propaganda, it was the same cycle: violence, chaos, brotherhood weaponized. The administration didn't stop it. In some ways, they fueled it. Because every time an inmate debriefed, every time someone gave up information in exchange for protection, the ranks of SNY grew stronger, and GP grew weaker. But California's biggest mistake was yet to come. In the 2020s, the CDCR began to experiment with something new: non-designated programming facilities. 50-50 yards. On these yards, general population inmates were housed side by side with SNY inmates, wolves and sheep, predators and prey, men who swore blood oaths against each other, suddenly eating at the same tables. The logic? Integration, reform, rehabilitation. The reality? Violence, ambushes, riots. Officers described it as working in a zoo. Except all the cages were open. Hector Bravo, a former lieutenant at Richard J. Donovan Prison, saw it firsthand. He oversaw crisis teams. He watched as integration brought bloodshed. And in 2022, after years of warning, after riots and near-death experiences, Bravo walked away. He resigned, disgusted. He called the administration's actions what they were: reckless disregard for life. Because let's be honest, the Norway model doesn't work here. It was never going to work here. California is not Norway. California's prisons are battlefields. They're run by organizations whose influence spills onto the streets. They are driven by race, by power, by a currency of fear that Norway has never known. And yet the CDCR parades out images of inmates gardening, playing with dogs, smiling in classrooms, an illusion of peace, a brochure picture of rehabilitation. But behind the curtain, 6 murders in 6 weeks. And the deeper truth is this: what happens inside the prisons of California is a mirror of what's happening outside them. Gang culture, political tribalism, splintered factions, a decay of traditional values, a lack of accountability from leadership, a culture where chaos becomes normal and respect becomes extinct. It's easy to laugh at prison politics, to think they're far removed from the real world, but they're not. They're a microcosm, and the collapse we see in the sensitive needs yards, the chaos of 50-50 yards, the decay of respect and order, it reflects something bigger: a cultural decline, a collapse of discipline, a nation struggling with the same questions its prisons face: punishment or rehabilitation, order or chaos, tradition or change. Inmates inside know one thing: if there are no rules, there is no safety. Maybe that's the question we should be asking ourselves too. Because if 6 murders can happen inside the walls of the California prison system in just 6 weeks, what happens when the walls outside start cracking?